Think about a serial killer. It's probably a man. Most likely a loner living in a private fantasy world. His murders are a closely guarded secret, and he's desperate to keep them that way. But there is another type. The serial killer who is not alone. My name's Mark Billingham, and I'm a crime writer. I spend my working life creating fictional killers, but in this series, I want to discover what creates those most horrific of real-life murderers, killer couples. In this episode, I'm looking at the bizarre case of killer butler Roy Hall and his accomplice Michael Kitto, two seasoned thieves who in 1977 suddenly turned to murder.
The case of Roy Hall and Michael Kitto is almost certainly the most incredible crime story you've never heard of. In one 6-month spree in 1977, 5 people were murdered, variously bludgeoned, suffocated, drowned, or shot to death, with the victims ranging from a paedophile burglar to a millionaire former MP. And yet, the story's been largely forgotten.
I was setting off on a journey to learn more about this killing spree. A spree which began with the perfect plan to rob the moneyed classes and ended with the murder of 3 criminal accomplices and 2 wealthy socialites. It was to be a story more reminiscent of comedy than tragedy, with fake butler Roy Hall and accomplice Michael Kitto dashing across Britain with a succession of bodies in the boot of their car. And this tragic farce was only halted when a hotel owner thought Kitto and Hall might run off without paying their bill.
I thought, no, there's something that's not true about you here. I mean, it wasn't a manner, because they were very mannerable, very well spoken, loved beautiful clothes on, beautiful clothes. So when they went into the dining room, I phoned the police.
When the police noticed a dodgy tax disc, Kitto and Hall were taken in and a body discovered in the boot of their car.
It was the next morning when the CID came back. I had said to him, I says, how's it going, how's the inquiry going? He said, well, we found 5 at the moment. I says, 5 what? He says, 5 bodies. I thought, well, here we go.
So how would this pair of dapper, respectable-looking men become mass murderers? Just who were Roy Hall and Michael Kitto? The pair had met in November 1977, when Hall was 53 and Kitto 39, and both had long criminal careers behind them. Roy Hall's background was particularly intriguing, as author Rick Glanville explained to me. Over numerous prison meetings, Rick was given a unique insight into the mind of a murderer.
When you heard him speak, you would have thought he could possibly be a very educated, almost like a Highland grandee. You imagine sort of almost like a posh Edinburgh accent, not the typical sort of Glaswegian working class man that he was. He was born in Glasgow in 1924. The family was quite fragmented. As a teenager, he'd been quite rebellious. He was social misfit, didn't form solid friendships, felt a bit of a loner. And one of the formative things for him was that he used to sneak off when he should have been at school, and he used to go and watch music hall, go and watch variety performances. What he said really struck him was the adulation that these performers could get on the stage, even if they come from a pretty humble background.
Rick told me that Roy also wanted to elevate himself above his humble beginnings, but he didn't choose the music hall. He chose crime. In the late 40s, Roy headed south to London and slowly integrated himself into the nightclub scene around Soho.
If you think about Soho at that time, it's basically run by different gangs like the Richardsons and the Krays. And he would have flitted in and out of all of this stuff. He would have loved the fact that he was sort of part of that. But I think he wouldn't have been competent or reliable enough to be trusted with some of the big jobs or anything, you know.
Roy's future, though, was not as a feared gangster. Instead, he used his love of performing to try and blend into the background, becoming a jewel thief and con man. Indeed, Rick Glanville never wrote his book on Hall, finding it impossible to trust the former conman stories. But Hall did eventually write an autobiography in which he boasted of his life of crime. He claimed he was both the greatest jewel thief in Britain and a perfect gentleman.
The stories Hall tells in his book are incredible. Daring raids, elaborate cons and graphic sexual descriptions. And a picture emerges of a man who didn't really care about people at all, who just used them for money or for sex, and who fancied himself as something of a master criminal.
Yet despite his grand ambitions, the truth was that between 1945 and 1977, Hall spent more time in prison than out of it. His future partner in crime, Michael Kitto, was a different, less flamboyant character with no pretense at criminal genius. Journalist Murray Morse was a reporter at the News of the World when he uncovered a treasure trove of Kitto and Hall evidence. The complete police files on the pair had been found in an attic in Edinburgh, and Murray saw confidential details of Michael Kitto's background.
He moved from pillar to post. He'd had a broken childhood, brought up in care. He drifted into the armed services, but got dishonourably discharged after he carried out a robbery. He then moved around the country, really, living in doss houses, picking up work wherever he could, but was regularly getting arrested by the police and appearing in court for petty crimes.
Kitto and Hall were poles apart in their criminal ambitions, but they had one thing in common. Both men were gay, and, not unusually for the time, had failed marriages behind them.
Well, among the witness statements in the file that I uncovered, there's plenty of evidence to show that certainly Kitto was gay. He was twice married, had a daughter by one of those relationships, but both his marriages ended in divorce after his wives found out that he was homosexual.
Kitto and Hall would eventually end up lovers, as well as partners in crime, but they wouldn't meet until November 1977. By that time, Roy Hall had already committed one murder alone. It was a murder that had its roots in a con devised by Hall more than a decade earlier.
As Roy moved in and out of prison in the 50s and 60s, like Pentonville here behind me, he hatched a new plan, and one that would ultimately have fatal consequences. He decided to become a butler.
As a butler, Hall had access to all the keys and treasures of the house and was in the perfect position to pinch the family silver. From the 60s on, Hall secured a variety of positions and perfected his butler persona. And by early 1977, he had found work as butler for the elderly Lady Margaret Hudson at Kirkleton Hall in Dumfriesshire.
I'm up in Scotland now, on my way to meet a couple who knew Roy Hall when he was working at Kirkleton Hall for Lady Hudson. It's the place where he turned from conman to killer.
road from Kirkleton Hall live Betty and Donald Finnan. They also worked for Lady Hudson in the 1970s.
They came here for messages for Lady Hudson.
And what were your first impressions of him?
Well, he was nice, immaculately dressed, well-mannered. I can't say anything against him.
And you came to know him pretty well, would you say?
Yes, he came quite a lot. He used to sit there in the chair.
Whilst Hall's smart dress and impeccable manners were fitting for a butler, his love of conning his employer was anything but.
And he was always wanting me to go and have an evening out with Betty and I at Langham. And we said, OK then. Well, it was a Friday evening, wasn't it, Betty? A Friday evening.
So we went to Langham and had a drink. And I says, I can't understand how you're out at 7 o'clock, Roy, because dinner is always at 8:15. He says, yes, it is. I says, it's always 8:15, the dinner's on the table. He says, I put the clocks on an hour forward. So
he was pulling the wool over Lady Hudson's eyes. Well, he was pulling the wool over everybody's
eyes. That's true, he was.
Do you think you ever knew the real Roy Hall?
Knew the real Roy Hall? No, definitely not. No. We only saw the good side of him.
That's right.
But the dark side of Roy Hall was about to come to the surface in the summer of 1977 with the appearance of a former lover from prison, David Wright. Hall intended the 32-year-old Wright to be his accomplice in the robbing of Lady Hudson. But after Hall secured Wright a job at Kirkleton Hall as gamekeeper, the plan would go fatally wrong. As a crime novelist, I create fictional murderers, but I could never have dreamt up a story quite like that of Michael Kitto and Roy Hall.
The pair only met in the late 70s, when Hall was 54 and Kitto 39. Before then, Kitto had flitted between casual work and minor crime. Hall, though, had had a rather more colourful life, as a jewel thief, a con man, and a butler. And it was as a butler that Roy Hall would first kill, alone.
That first victim was a man named David Wright. Hall had intended Wright to be his accomplice in the robbing of his employer Lady Hudson, but the plan went disastrously wrong, as Hall's former colleague Betty Finnan told me.
David Wright was supposed to get engaged to this girl at Dumfries, and he'd taken one of Lady Hudson's rings. Lady Hudson was away, and Roy said he must return the ring before she came back, and there had been a row. And David Wright had tried to shoot Roy, and the bullet went through the headboard.
It seems at this point Hall decided to kill Wright, but not immediately, as he explained to would-be biographer Rick Glanville.
It was with real glee that he was telling me about how he had sex with Wright before he killed him. He said, I'll tell you how I killed Wright. We'd agreed what we would steal. He took too much. I plied him with drink until he was rolling drunk. Then I took him upstairs and fucked him.
Hall's stories are notoriously unreliable, but what happened next is undisputed. The following day, the two apparently reconciled men went hunting.
The following morning, they had a pre-arranged date to go rabbit shooting, and he very coolly and calculatedly got the guns, made sure that Wright's was empty, and then quite almost like someone out of Goodfellas, when Wright said, isn't it a lovely day, he said something almost sort of very theatrical like, yeah, lovely day, but this is the last day you'll see, and then he shot him.
And he buried him just beside Pocaskin Burn. And he used to take Lady Hudson's golden Labrador a walk. Well, when it stopped at the spot, he knew that another dog would find. So every time he went and Tessa stopped, He put more stones and dirt on the grave to keep covering it up until Tessa walked over it. No hesitation, you know, didn't smell it. And he knew then his secret was safe.
Roy Hall could no longer claim to be a gentleman thief. He was a murderer, and he had killed in the most ruthless, organised way imaginable. Having killed his former lover, he left for a new life in London, where he would meet Michael Kitto. One murderer was about to become two. In October 1977, Hall found himself a post butlering for the unfortunate Walter and Dorothy Scott Elliott. He was an 82-year-old former MP, and she a wealthy Anglo-Indian woman 20 years his junior. And for the would-be thief, the location was a dream. Knightsbridge, West London.
Well, this is 200 Sloane Street. We're in the heart of Knightsbridge. We've got Harrods up there, Mayfair over there. And in this block behind me is where Hall landed his job with Dorothy and Walter Scott Elliott. Perfect job, of course, for Hall. Ample opportunities to be the jewel thief he wanted to be, to move in the society he wanted to move in. As far as Hall was concerned, he'd landed on his feet. Didn't work out quite so well, of course, with the Scott Elliots.
Once again, he's trading on this sort of the dodgy references that he's had, and his ability to move seamlessly between this sort of jewellery theft and being a sort of quite highly rated butler.
And as with Lady Hudson, the Scott Elliots were very fond of him.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think also, if you think about the sort of the doors that being part of the Scott Elliott household would have opened up to him, he would have been able to case the joints of neighbouring properties. So it was a very good opening for him.
But it was an opening that Hall was about to blow in quite spectacular style, and he would not do it alone. Hall made contact with a woman who had once been his lover, petty criminal Mary Coggle, and asked her to find him a potential accomplice.
In November 1977, at this pub behind me here in King's Cross, Hall's one-time lover Mary Coggle introduced him to a friend of hers named Michael Kitto, and a deadly partnership began.
Kitto was not exactly the experienced thief Hall was after, and confidential police files on the case, seen by journalist Murray Morse, reveal that Kitto thought he had struck gold in meeting Hall.
Well, at the time Kitto was introduced to Hall, he was actually on the run for a petty crime. He'd robbed a pub where he'd been working as a barman. So once he'd met Hall and found out what the plans were, he was pretty ecstatic. This was much bigger than anything he'd ever done before, and he was part of a gang, for want of a better word, that were thinking through some pretty spectacular burglaries or robberies that would net them quite a lot of money.
So it's a big step up.
Big step up in terms of the sort of crime that he'd done before. And I think what's apparent from the material in the file is that he was clearly in awe of Hall, and he was clearly flattered by the fact that he'd been sought out and that Hall wanted him as part of his plans. The truth, as we know, is completely different, that Hall had asked Mary Coggle to find him someone. She'd found someone who was probably nothing like the sort of person that Hall needed.
So the killer couple was born, the self-professed great jewel thief and the haphazard petty criminal. It puzzled me, though, why Hall would stick with Kitto as his accomplice. I sought the help of a man who has studied the relationship closely, criminal psychologist Ian Stephen.
On the face of it, they were an incredibly strange couple. I mean, on the one hand, you've got Roy Hall, who is flamboyant, larger than life, whereas Kitto's very much a kind of run-of-the-mill petty criminal.
I think it's a strange relationship, but I think Hall himself was a petty criminal originally, and then he, after his period down in London and the prisons down there, became a bit more sophisticated and developed the butler, the flamboyant artiste way of doing the crime. So I think this was the alternate, this was his alter ego in a sense.
After preliminary burglaries of the neighbours, Kitto and Hall set about planning the big one, the robbery of Dorothy and Walter Scott Elliott.
They hatched this idea that they would do, if you like, a Lady Hudson. They'll gradually steal bits and pieces from this quite sadly doddery elderly couple.
So how does it move from this quite clever plan of gradually robbing this old couple to murdering them?
Well, the plan falls apart because Lady Scott Elliott stumbles in when they're either sort of looking at what they can steal, or they're actually in the process of stealing some of the stuff. And Kitto is there. Now, Kitto doesn't have any right to be there, and they shouldn't be in private parts of the building. So they decide instantly Lady Scott Elliott has to be dispensed with.
In police statements, Kitto and Hall each blamed the other for Dorothy Scott Elliott's murder. But one of them suffocated the 63-year-old, and Kitto and Hall had started something they couldn't stop.
This is not a sort of, if you like, a bit of a wastrel like Wright was, you know, a petty criminal himself. We're now talking about a London socialite, someone on the social scene there, whose disappearance will be noticed.
And the first person to notice would be Dorothy's husband Walter, upstairs asleep at the time of his wife's murder.
What they did was they told him that effectively his wife had gone to Scotland. They had been planning a trip, flying up to Aberdeen, and they managed to persuade him that they would drive him up to Scotland.
Kitto and Hall's plan was quite simply insane. They drugged the already frail Walter Scott Elliott and dressed Mary Coggle in his wife's clothes. They then made a 3-day journey to the north of Scotland, stopping at pubs and hotels along the way.
I mean, a bizarre foursome, really. There's Kitto, the accomplice, there's Coggle, the former girlfriend, who is wearing some of Lady Scott Elliott's clothes, a fur coat, a hat, and sort of carrying airs and graces and passing herself off as Scott Elliott's wife. How they thought that could be inconspicuous, you know, around the Britain of the 1970s. They're actually making up as they go along.
When they got to Scotland, they found a desolate moor somewhere and took him out of the car and murdered him. And again, we see the ruthless streak from Hall. He told Kitto to do the job, but he hadn't done the job properly, and actually when they were walking away, they heard groaning. Hall claimed that he'd sent Kitto back to finish Scott Elliott off with a shovel. But it's more than likely that Hall, in fact, killed Lord Scott Elliott himself by standing on his throat and crushing his windpipe.
Hall and Kitto had known each other less than a month, but had already killed 2 people. Hall himself had also killed David Wright 3 months previously, and things were about to get messier still. Their co-conspirator Mary Coggle had developed a worrying habit of drawing attention to herself, wearing Dorothy Scott Elliott's coat everywhere she went. And Kitto and Hall had developed an even more alarming way of dealing with their problems: murder. planned to rob his employers, Walter and Dorothy Scott Elliott, with accomplice Michael Kitto. But the pair were discovered and ended up killing both the Scott Elliots in December 1977. They had only known each other a month, but the dynamic of the relationship was set from the start, with Hall in charge and Kitto the junior partner.
Kitto, I think, was dependent on Hall, but Hall, to some extent, liked to have an assistant or somebody to do things with. I think every crime he had in the 70s, he seemed to have an accomplice. So I think there was a sort of partner, but a subservient partner who perhaps admired the way he worked.
So there was an element of showing off, an element
Probably
of
a bit of showing off, because he liked to be a con man, he liked to be the Mr. Smooth, Mr. Do-It, but although the problem was when he actually started offending, he was a bit chaotic.
In a bid to escape the chaos, the pair, along with their co-conspirator Mary Coggle, headed to the quiet village of Newton Arlosh in Cumbria. They rented a cottage, and Kitto and Hall, though not Coggle, became regulars at the local pub. There I met farmer Hubert Wilson to ask him what villagers remembered about the two killers in their midst.
So, Hubert, what did you make of the two of them?
They were just ordinary two chaps. Rented the cottage up the road, and they said he was dealing antiques, and everybody accepted that.
This is Hall.
This is all, yeah.
But they were quite an odd couple, weren't they? I mean, Hall's very kind of immaculate.
Well, he didn't dress like you for a set-off, like, yeah. No, he was always well dressed, like, you know what I mean, like, yeah. Probably looked a class above anybody else, like, yeah. And, well, he was a man. He was, if there were partners, he was the boss, like, yeah. If there were antique dealers, he was doing the dealing, so to speak.
Right.
And Kitto was more casual, like, yeah. Kitto was quite interested in football and this sort of sport, like, yeah. And, in fact, Kitto took our boys to the football match. I think it was one Christmas, yeah. I think it was Boxing Day. Kitto said, well, I'll take them. It was good of them, really. So he took them and went to the match with them. It just seemed a normal sort of a blow.
But Michael Kitto was not the normal bloke he seemed. By the time he'd taken Hubert's boys to watch the football on Boxing Day 1977, he'd been involved in his third murder. And the victim was his old pal, Mary Coggle.
Once they'd robbed the Scott Elliots, she couldn't resist showing off. She was wearing one of Lady Scott Elliott's fur coats, the jewellery, so that she would instantly draw attention to herself, and it was a possible loose end that had to be tied up. So again, Hall decided that he was going to get rid of Mary.
Hall's statement to police suggested she had fallen off a small bridge during a fight and cracked her skull, yet forensic reports told a different story.
Mary Coggle had clearly received a terrible beating, and we think that she'd been beaten to death with a poker at the cottage where Hall had put up Coggle and Kitto.
This is the bridge from which Kitto and Hall threw Mary Coggle's body after they'd killed her. Killed her for being unwilling to part with Dorothy Scott Elliott's fur coat. Understandable that she wanted to hang on to it, poor as her life was. Very sad end to a very sad life.
Mary Coggle's killing would not be the last. The new year of 1978 brought another murder, the most inexplicable of them all. Method of killing.
The file shows that his brother had used chloroform on him before he was plunged into the bath, and in fact it was the chloroform that probably killed him rather than being drowned. and Hall actually became the first victim of a chloroform murder in British history.
But just why was Donald Hall killed? In fact, why was he even invited to the cottage?
The dispatching of Donald Hall really is quite a puzzle. A number of different things that I never quite worked out. One is that they knew that he was coming out of prison. When they were sort of up and down the country, it would have been very difficult to keep in touch. And then, again, there's this sort of quite clumsy method of killing where they chloroform him, you know, so that he's unconscious. And then, for God's sake, this is your half-brother. You carry him around in the boot of the car for days.
This fifth murder was a real puzzle, but one man thought he had the answer, to Roy Hall's motive at least. Len Murray was Roy Hall's lawyer, and I persuaded him to take a break from a round of golf to explain what Hall claimed was his motive for killing Donald.
The one thing that he cared about above all else in life was the welfare of his daughter, Caroline. And indeed it was because of that that he killed his half-brother. He regarded the half-brother as being something of a paedophile who clearly took a fancy to Caroline.
Now, he and Donald had never got on, had they?
No, they never had. But as soon as Hall realised that his half-brother might feel this way, that was really the day the death warrant was signed.
Hall's excuse seemed too convenient to me. He rarely saw his daughter and barely mentions her in his autobiography. Perhaps Hall, with Kitto in tow, had reached the point where killing meant nothing and just saw an opportunity to dispose of someone he disliked.
Do you think Hall was a man to whom the taking of a human life was significant? He seems to have done it for a variety of different reasons. You know, he'd kill one person to cover up the murder of another.
None of which was terribly persuasive. No, part of the schizophrenic nature of the man, I imagine, was the fact that life was very cheap so far as he was concerned.
So you don't think he was somebody overly troubled by conscience?
I'm not entirely sure if he had one, but if he did, it didn't trouble him over much at all.
If he needed to murder someone, he murdered them.
Yeah.
Whatever the reason Donald was killed, his murder would be Kitto and Hall's undoing. On the 16th of January 1978, the pair once again bundled the body into their car and headed north to Scotland. That evening, they pulled into the small seaside town of North Berwick and booked a room at the Blenheim House Hotel. There, I met the hotel's former owner, Norman Wright, the man responsible for ending Kitto and Hall's killing spree.
There were no staff on duty, it was just Mrs. White, myself, and we were both in the bar here when Kitto and Hall walked in and asked for bed and breakfast. And I started chatting to them, but I don't know, there was something about them that I just didn't like.
Straight away? You started to get
Yes,
suspicious straight away?
More or less straight away. So when they went into the dining room, I phoned the police, because I thought they'd stayed for bed and breakfast in Dumfries somewhere and ran away in the morning without paying.
Oh, okay.
So they came along and had a look at the car, and I never thought of checking, but they checked the tax disc.
And this tax disc was to be the pair's undoing, as it did not match the car's number plate.
The police said to me, can we speak to them? I said, certainly. So I went in and I said, the police would like to have a word with you boys. I certainly bring them in. So they went in.
Very calm?
Oh yes, very calm. The police then took them along to the police station, and the CID came over, and the CID took the car away, and it was them that discovered the body in the boot.
Kitto and Hall now had a lot of explaining to do. But Roy Hall was in no mood to explain, so instead, he made a run for it. So far, I've heard how Hall murdered his previous accomplice, David Wright, in September 1977. 2 months later, Hall teamed up with petty criminal Michael Kitto to rob Hall's employers, Walter and Dorothy Scott Elliott. But the pair were caught in the act and ended up murdering both the Scott Elliots, followed by co-conspirator Mary Coggle and finally Hall's half-brother Donald. By January 16th, 1978, Kitto and Hall were heading up the east coast of Scotland with Donald's body in their boot. That was until a suspicious hotelier thought they might do a runner. He called the police, who noticed a dodgy tax disc, and took the pair in for questioning. Mike Webster was one of those police officers.
They were quite cool and calm. Kitto very quiet, but Hall was doing all the talking. He was obviously the leader, and he was very, very good. I mean, he just, any questions you asked him, he could answer them right off.
So when did the situation escalate from something, you know, from an irregularity to do with the vehicle to something a bit more serious?
It would be when Hall, who had been going to the toilet regularly, decided that he wasn't coming back this time, and I found that he had gone out the toilet window in the station.
But this is before you'd searched the vehicle?
Yeah. Once he's gone, well, obviously there was something seriously wrong. We then commenced a search, and while we were searching, the duty inspector had come down and found the naked body of a male in the boot of the car.
You've got no idea at this point who the body is,
no,
where it's come from?
Not a clue, it's just a male body lying in the boot of the car.
But you've got a suspected murderer on the loose?
Yeah, so he was quite distinctive. As I recall, he was wearing a blazer with I think an open neck shirt on, but he did have a red and white spotted hanky in his top pocket. So later on that night, he was captured at Walliford in a road check.
It was to be Roy Hall's last brief taste of freedom. After his recapture, Kitto started to spill the beans, and Hall quickly followed suit.
And then when I came in on the back shift the following day, we discovered that, you know, they've now got all these guys, all these bodies lying about. It just beggars belief, really, that all that came out of tax disc.
Hall and Kitto had been caught, and their killing spree was over. Within 24 hours, the pair were talking, and the tale they told was unbelievable. It began with the murder of Hall's former accomplice David Wright, killed by Hall alone. It continued with the murder of wealthy former MP Walter Scott Elliott and his wife Dorothy. And it ended with the killing of petty criminals Mary Coggle and Roy Hall's half-brother Donald. And if the pair hadn't aroused the suspicions of hotel owner Norman Wright, it's likely there would have been a sixth victim. Hall was planning to kill his partner in crime Michael Kitto the night he was arrested at Blenheim House Hotel.
The police reckon that he was going to be done that night, and here, because the gun was still in the car when it was lying in the car park. And the police said to me, he says, "I think you've saved us from number 6.
If I was Kitto, I'd have been looking at the methodology, and I'd have been looking at who the victims were, and I'd have been thinking, well, if he's covering his tracks, you know, he's killed his brother, I've got to be next. It would happen like that, and once the decision was made, it was only a matter of time before I had to go as well.
In the conscience-free world of Roy Hall, it made sense to kill Kitto. After all, he'd killed his previous accomplice and had nothing to lose from one more murder. Because, though this was a double act, the pair had very unequal billing. Kitto was the junior and expendable partner, and Hall the dominant force, the apparent headline grabber. And yet Roy Hall's name is not one we know today. But why? Criminal psychologist Ian Stevens suggested it was because Hall and Kitto never threatened the public, unlike killers such as the Yorkshire Ripper. Between 1975 and 1980, Peter Sutcliffe murdered 13 women, and Kitto and Hall were arrested in the middle of that spree.
They didn't seem to catch the imagination the same way as the Yorkshire Ripper and other people did, because of the nature of the crime, I suspect, was a bit more chaotic. Whereas the Ripper and other criminals like that, you were dealing with an ongoing fear in the population. And perhaps Hall was a bit more within his own circle of friends, so to speak, when he did killings. He wasn't such a fearful person to the general population.
Because he didn't kill strangers?
He didn't kill strangers. It was only if you were actually involved with them that you were at risk.
Just don't get to know Roy Hall.
Yeah, that's basically.
Perhaps another reason the pair was somehow less shocking was down to Hall's con-man charm. His lawyer, Len Murray, explained that Hall's arrest for murder did nothing to affect his butler persona.
He presented very well. He was very articulate. He appeared to me to be a thoroughly intelligent individual. I remember on the day of my first meeting, the Detective Chief Inspector in charge of the inquiry, he said to me, I'd be very welcome to come along to police headquarters and see him, and we could have a chat about the case. And I said, yeah, I'll bring Roy along and he can serve the tea for us. And Roy drew himself up, you know, and there he was. You could visualize the butler. And he said, that would be a pleasure, sir. And, you know, I visualized him in his butler's gear at that moment.
Roy Hall was a performer, and a good one. But he was as adept at fooling himself as everyone else, not least in blaming Kitto for the murders that followed his own botched plan.
Hall regarded Kitto as being the worst thing that ever happened to him in his life.
Why is that?
He blamed Kitto for the difficulty in which he found himself. My personal view is that Kitto would probably have been Hall's next victim. So it's probably just as well that they were caught. At the time they were caught.
Why did he blame Kitto?
No, he blamed Kitto for setting him off again on a career of crime. Why Hall should blame Kitto is one of the great mysteries so far as I'm concerned, because Kitto, for example, had nothing at all to do with the murder of David Wright down in Dumfriesshire.
That murder had taken place 2 months before he had met Kitto, but Hall wasn't one to let facts get in the way of a good story. When the case came to court in Edinburgh, though, Hall was for once reticent, allowing Kitto to emerge from the shadows.
Oddly enough, they appeared before, I think it was Lord Wiley in the High Court in Edinburgh, on Michael Kitto's 40th birthday.
Right.
Kitto and Hall were both sentenced to life imprisonment. Hall had absolutely nothing to say, and as they were going into custody, again, Kitto turned to the press bench beside him and said, ah, well, life begins at 40.
That joke of Michael Kitto's, the whole life begins at 40 thing, sums up this case for me. I mean, 5 people died. It's a tragedy. But with all the farcical elements involved, the dashing across country, the dressing up, bodies in the boot, the whole thing's closer to black comedy than anything. There is this vein of dark comedy running through this story.
Absolutely.
It's really bizarre. Talking to people about this case, the people I'm talking to find themselves smiling, find themselves laughing, find themselves describing. It's almost impossible to see this in the same kind of light as you would see Peter Sutcliffe or Hindley and Brady or some
Absolutely.
of, you know, but why is that? I mean, 5 people died.
You've hit the nail on the head that it is almost like a black comedy. The title of my book was going to be The Butler Did It. The cliche of the butler doing it in every Agatha Christie story. A butler could be in the most powerful position in any particular household. They know where everything is, they know the comings and goings, and it makes his incompetence, if you like, about being discovered or not executing his plans properly even more, I would have thought, alarming for him. He's like Dick Dastardly. It's like, oh, veteran, you know, I would have gotten away with it.
Roy Hall died in 2002, the oldest lifer in the British prison system. As for Kitto, He was eventually released, though where he lives today is a mystery. He remains a character stubbornly in the background.
Roy Hall was in every sense the front man of this pair. He'd killed before Kitto, and chances are he was about to kill Kitto himself. I've got no sympathy for a mass murderer, but I doubt Kitto would have killed anybody without meeting Roy Hall. He just lacked the courage or the morals to resist the older man. As for Roy Hall, perhaps there's some poetic justice in the fact that this man who sought attention so much has been largely forgotten.